So, hello, I'm Alice Hutchinson, the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I'm honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by author Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award-winning and nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, puts it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So with that, I welcome you, and please join us every Monday evening at this time as many of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other and with you in an effort to bring us together. If you missed last week's episode with Frank Bedart and Robert Lopez, or any of the previous episodes of Write America, you can go to Birds Books Crowdcast channel and watch. Well, we're not going to have you go to Crowdcast after Labor Day. We're going to be on Crowdcast till Labor Day, and then we're going to switch over to Zoom. And you can watch the recordings at any time. Tonight's episode is also being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch. Tonight, Birds Books hosts readings by and conversation with Denisha Smith and David Nasaw. I will return at the end at the readings and discussion to bring your questions and additional questions to the authors. I think everybody here is familiar with Zoom. Please feel free to comment in the chat. If you have a question, I'll try and snag it, but I do have a list of questions that I'm going to be asking the authors. Our first speaker is Denisha Smith. Denisha Smith is the author of 5 novels and numerous short stories. Her latest novel, The Prince, March of 2022, this year, is a contemporary retelling of Henry James' The Golden Bowl. For 11 years, Denisha was a reporter at the New York Times, where she wrote about literature and the arts. She's also an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. A drama she wrote and directed, Passing Quietly Through, was one of the first films by a woman to be chosen for the New York Film Festival. Please welcome to the spotlight, Denisha Smith. So I'm going to add you as a spotlight, and you need to unmute, dearie.
Okay.
Let me go away.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about my new novel, The Prince, which is, as Al said, a retelling in contemporary terms of Henry James' great work, The Golden Bowl. That was published in 1904. My novel is set, The Prince is set in 2021 and written in ordinary English, not in the complex style that's characteristic of Henry James's late novels. It's the story of an extremely wealthy family with a terrible secret. The Woodford family in my novel is descended from a late 19th century steel magnate who made his fortune on the backs of his workers in West Virginia. The robber barons were mostly brutal, uneducated people. Their descendants, perhaps somewhat guilty about the origins of their wealth, have often devoted themselves to charitable occupations and philanthropy. The Rockefellers, for instance, have in this century and the last gone into the law and medicine, and they've become environmentalists. They've built museums. Nonetheless, they're still surrounded by this immense wealth, and in a way they can't escape their inheritance and the burdens of their history. And this is one of the things I was very interested in this novel, how inherited wealth plays down through the generations. The patriarch of my novel is Henry Woodford, a widower, a descendant of a 19th century steel magnate. Now he's become a public interest lawyer, but still the Woodford family lives in a kind of bubble. There is money in the very air they breathe. Henry is very close to his daughter, Emily, a sweet, rather innocent young woman who's grown up in the bubble of this wealth. She is engaged to a penniless Italian Prince Federico. Again, there's some historical resonance here, as many of the robber baron families married their daughters off to impoverished European aristocrats, thereby gaining respectability for themselves, and the aristocrats got their money. The wedding is about to occur in the Woodfords' big private island in Long Island Sound, when an old girlfriend of the prince's, Christina, arrives in New York. Federico and Christina had once been deeply in love, but the prince broke up with her because neither had the money to marry. Christina also happens to be a childhood friend of his future bride's, Emily. Christina's arrival stuns the prince, and I'm going to read here from the effect it has on him. And there she was, standing before him, tall, slender, long-necked, her dark blonde hair pulled back today, her skin luminous in the heat. She wore a sleeveless blue cotton dress, loose-fitting and plain, with a low, square neck, which showed her slender arms and legs and her thin feet and long toes. Unmoving, she looked back at Federico, her head held high, amused. This was Christina, strong, defended, slightly mocking. Federico, she said, I didn't know you were here. He went toward her. They kissed on both cheeks in the formal European manner, and the familiar fragrance of her body enveloped him, the scent of the lavender shampoo and lotion which had always emanated from her. He stepped back. He saw that her pale green eyes were laughing at him, and yet he saw too, beneath that, the hardness and the hurt. What brought you here? He asked. I'm coming to the wedding, she said. The prince's wedding goes forward. One of the things I enjoyed about writing the novel was imagining this private island in Long Island Sound. It was a primeval place, a private paradise, one of the largest islands in the country, still in private hands, 6 miles long, just under 4 miles off the mainland, and owned by the family through a series of interlocking trusts. It is a place of transparent waters swirling onto the pristine shore, primeval forests of first growth, white oak and beech, ponds with graceful white egrets skimming along the surface, osprey nests dotting the grounds, flocks of white-tailed deer grazed heedlessly. The prince and Emily have a child. Meanwhile, the prince and Christina's passion for one another lurks beneath the surface. And one rainy autumn day, the prince is alone in their house and the doorbell rings. And it's Christina, his old girlfriend. Here is the section when she arrives again. She stood against the firelight in the gloomy afternoon, the margins of her body lit up by the flames. In the warmth of the fire, her skin glowed. Her hair had dried now, and it was full and sun-streaked and flowed down over her shoulders. Despite himself, he began to move slowly, inexorably towards her. There's no one here, he said. The woman's out. She's got the afternoon off. She nodded, her eyes fixed on him. He touched her waist, and then he pushed his hand under her shirt. After all this time, he felt her flesh, the familiar pulse of her life. There was no going back. They were in his and Emily's house. Anyone could come. It was wrong. It would destroy his world. But they were beyond that now. They go on to meet secretly in places like Central Park, in terrible, cheap hotels in Midtown. They resolved to stay apart. But after only a few days, the need built up again, and it happened once more in his own house when Emily was gone and wouldn't be back for hours, and the housekeeper was out in the basement in the dark. The smell of damp and fuel in the air, quick. And then she was gone again. They took a room in a derelict hotel in Midtown, $60 an hour. But they didn't care. They took the risk. So as this happens, Emily begins to sense the tension between her husband and her old friend, although she doesn't articulate it even to herself, the totality of her suspicions. Instead, she encourages her widowed father to have a relationship with her friend, Christina, perhaps to drive a wedge between her and the prince and forestall a crisis. Henry Woodford, the father, rules over them all like a king. He thought he would never get over the devastating death of his wife, but he's entranced by the beautiful young woman. And here they have a relationship. He rested on her bed and watched her long-limbed body move naked about the room, and he saw a vision of youth and perfection. For the next days, it was as if he was a young man again in his eagerness and his enjoyment of her. And always she seemed to give back his affection. Her lovemaking was as passionate as if she hadn't done this for a very long time, and something had been released in her. He'd come home at last, and he discovered in this young body the peace he'd craved for so long, without having realized how much he craved. Meanwhile, the family gatherings are a new kind of hell. All of them, I'm reading, all of them sitting together, he and Christina, that is Federico and Christina, pretending they hardly knew one another and that they were a normal, happy family. He sat through these family meals in a state of suspended animation and disbelief, across from his father-in-law, a kind and generous man, and alongside his sweet, bird-like wife. Christina was composed, more reserved than usual. This was her husband. Henry and Emily seemed unaware of what was happening. This was her husband and his wife. They were intimate with them. They knew them the way husband and wives always knew their spouses. How could they not notice what was happening right in front of their eyes? Okay, so we keep going, and the central question of this novel for me is, how will the family solve this problem of a mother-in-law sleeping with her son-in-law, and all of them are good people and they all love their spouses, which was one of the interesting literary issues in the novel, because these are not bad people. How will they solve the problem? How much will they acknowledge this to themselves? Someone wrote of Henry James that for James, love is not wanting to know. And I think that is a very good description here, because as a writer, the problem for me was to convey this dawning awareness without articulating it. So Henry James' resolution in the 1904 novel has been called monstrous. It's against this background of gentility and good manners. And I stole it from him. But I think I'm going to leave it to you to learn how they resolve this crisis. Thank you. Back to Alice.
Thank you, Denisha. Let me figure out how to remove that. There we go. Our next speaker is David Nasaw. David Nasaw is the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History Emeritus at CUNY Graduate Center and past president of the Society of American Historians. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University. The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War was published in September 2020 and was named the Book of the Year by National Public Radio and History Today. Nassaw's previous book, The Patriarch, The Remarkable Life and Turbulent Times of Joseph P. Kennedy, was chosen by the New York Times as one of the 5 best nonfiction books of the year and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in biography. David Nasaw is also the author of Andrew Carnegie, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and the winner of the New York Historical Society America History Book Prize. And The Children of the City at Work and at Play was the source of Newsies, the film and the musical. Please welcome David Nasaw. David, let me get you unmute and add you in. There you go. Let me get myself on the screen. Of course.
Delighted to be here. Let me begin by saying that this is going to be very different from what Denisha had to say. We are related by marriage, but not by literary genre, as you'll soon see. My book that I'm going to be reading from, The Last Million, is about the last million refugees. They were called displaced persons in this instance. And the last million were left behind in Germany, for the most part, when the war was over, and remained in displaced persons camps, often behind barbed wire, for 3 to 5 years after the war was over, while the so-called civilized nations of the world tried to figure out what to do with them. So I read, the violence of war did not end with the signing of ceasefires, truces, or peace treaties. War bled into post-war, and millions of innocents who had never taken up arms continued to suffer long after the soldiers had gone home. Germany was in free fall. Chaos reigned. National, regional, and local military, police, and political authorities had abandoned their posts. There was literally no one directing traffic, no one policing the streets, no one delivering the mail or picking up the garbage or bringing food to the shops. No one stopping the looting, the rape, the revenge taking, as millions of homeless, ill-clothed, malnourished, disoriented foreigners, Jewish survivors, Polish forced laborers, former Nazi collaborators, all displaced persons jammed the town squares, the roadways and marketplaces, begging, threatening, desperate. The American and British soldiers moving east into Germany and the reporters who accompanied them were transfixed by what Collier's magazine columnist W.B. Courtney referred to as the war's living wreckage. Living, moving, pallid wreckage. Quote from Courtney, it washed up and down the margins of the Autobahn in a dragging tide. It was composed of people of all sizes, ages, races, and varieties of garments. A few had bicycles, some pushed hand carts. The majority, however, rolled baby carriages. The baby carriage is the sorriest joke in Europe today. You never see a baby in one. Instead, they are filled with pots and pans and tools and all the impediments of nomads. There were shivering maids and youths in shirts and shorts with legs blue and raw. There were released German soldiers with their army packs and cut branches for walking sticks. You knew the displaced persons by the bulk of their clothing and the magnitude of their bundles. A man wearing 2 or 3 suits, a woman wearing several dresses and a couple of coats, and carrying more were not unusual sights. None seemed to want food. Their want lay sadly deeper, and you could not touch it with your pity, but could only surmise that it was for country and home and news of loved ones. Having once seen the wandering last millions of Europe, you could never forget them, even if you could never fully know what thoughts were in their minds or what lumps were in their hearts. Barely clothed, this is David, barely clothed in ripped and ragged, oversized, striped camp uniforms, the Jewish survivors were distinguishable from the others by their pallor, emaciated physiques, shaved heads, lice-infested bodies, and the vacant look in their eyes. Quote, you could see them walking down the street, Chaplain Herbert Eskin of the US Army recalled. Quote, some of them with torn shoes, barefooted, with long coats, the women and the men with the pajamas, you know, dirty, very short hair, looking to talk to someone for aid. The vast majority of Jewish survivors remained in the concentration camps, too ill to leave on their own. The soldiers who encountered them tell the same stories of initial shock, then disgust, accompanied by alternating waves of pity, anger, and stomach-churning illness, followed by a body and soul-wearying sadness that would not dissipate, a disillusionment with all things human, an enervating, pervasive disquiet that would remain with them, the American and British soldiers, for the rest of their lives. On April 11th, Buchenwald was liberated by the inmates, hours before the arrival of the American army, but after the Germans had evacuated some 28,000 prisoners, a third of whom had died in sealed railroad cars or on arrival at their new camps. On entering the camp, American soldiers from the 6th Armored Division of the 3rd Army found 20,000 inmates, 4,000 of whom were Jews. Their first task was the burial of the dead and the triage of the living. Thousands of corpses littered the ground or were stacked in sheds or uncovered graves. Among the living were those known within the camps as the Musulman, the unworldly, ghastly, ghostly, walking dead, too ill, too weak, too hurting to be moved, who had to be removed on stretchers to hospital facilities. Those afflicted with or dying of typhus were quarantined and left to perish. Those who were ambulatory were moved to assembly centers to be patched together again and sent from there to displaced persons camps. Chaplain Herschel Schachter of Brooklyn, the youngest of 10 children of Polish Jewish emigres, commandeered a Jeep and drove to Buchenwald the day it was liberated. As we approached the area, he wrote later, the first thing that struck me was these huge gates. I walked through, I could see the huge smokestacks, and I rushed in that direction. There were piles of human bodies stacked like cordwood, waiting to be shoveled into the crematorium. And he continued it in oral history. I couldn't tarry very long there, moved on looking for living Jews. I was peering into the faces of some people who were walking around, and I had no way of knowing who was a Jew and who wasn't. And I finally stopped one little guy, and I just asked him in Yiddish whether there were any Jews here. And he said, of course. And he quickly led me to a small compound in this huge camp that was wholly reserved only for Jews. It was by far the most dilapidated and rundown area. There were in the first barrack a few hundred people who were obviously too weak, too sick, too bewildered to get out of the barracks. All I did was call out in a loud Yiddish, Shalom Aleichem Yidden, ihr sind frei. I was under the impression that many of the people there were not even aware of what had happened. I went from barracks to barracks, and each one repeated the Shalom Aleichem and explained that I am an American, that I am a rabbi. And we have come to help them when the war was over. Liberation for most of the Jewish survivors arrived with the American and British soldiers who entered the gates, calling out in foreign languages they did not understand, telling them that they were free. After those, the Frenchmen, the Italians, the Russians, the Western Europeans, the Americans who had been German prisoners of war, forced laborers were sent home. There remained left behind in Germany more than 1 million displaced persons, warehoused in camps overseen by the occupying military authorities and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Authority, UNRWA. The Polish Catholics comprised the largest group of displaced persons. They had come to Germany as forced laborers during the war. They had homes and families to go back to, but were afraid of returning to a devastated land whose future they did not know. They preferred to remain in the relative safety of the displaced persons camps. Large numbers of the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians in the camps had collaborated with the Nazi occupiers. Some had participated in the slaughter of their Jewish neighbors. A significant number had fought in German uniforms as part of the Waffen-SS units, but they had taken off their uniforms and made believe now that they were only poor displaced persons and were allowed into the camps. The Jewish survivors, still alive when the war ended, had no families, no homes, no loved ones to return to. Their ultimate destination, they hoped, would be a Jewish homeland in Palestine or with family members in the United States or Canada. But for now, they had no choice but to remain in the displaced persons camps in Germany, where they were fed, sheltered, protected, and where they occupied a measure of security they had not known since the war began. The camps in which the last million would spend the next 3 to 5 years were conceived as temporary facilities, but converted by the displaced persons into island communities divided by nationality, each with their own police forces, administrative committees, churches, schools, theaters, newspapers, choral groups for the Estonian and Lithuanians, lots of churches for the Poles, even more synagogues, musical groups, and concerts for the Jews. The last million were able to exert some control over their daily lives, but not over their futures. Their fate was in the hands of the Allies, who remained divided for what to do with them. The British and the Americans tried to get them to go home, but when they wouldn't, cared for them in the displaced persons camps. The Soviets and their Eastern European allies demanded that there was no such thing as displaced persons, except maybe for the Jews. And anyone who was still in Germany was a slacker or a Nazi sympathizer. After a year of fruitless and increasingly acrimonious debate, the British and the Americans concluded that they were not going to be able to repatriate the last million. They would have to resettle them instead. And they invited the nations of the world to come. The nations of the world that suffered a labor shortage to come to the displaced persons camps and pick and choose the healthiest, the smartest, the most able to emigrate to their nations. The first choices of the recruiters were the Latvians and Estonians because they were white, Protestant, healthier than the forced laborers and concentration camp survivors, reliably anti-communist, and with a reputation for being disciplined and diligent. No one wanted the Jews. With no legal route out of the camps and no one inviting them to resettle, as was the case with all the other Eastern Europeans, thousands of Jews left clandestinely for ports from which they could sail to and enter Palestine. The United States was among the last nations to welcome the last million for resettlement, save those whom the CIA and State Department deemed useful for clandestine Cold War campaigns at home and abroad. The CIA, the State Department, and other government institutions brought into this country hundreds, thousands, we'll never know how many Nazi collaborators who they considered would be useful in the coming Cold War. It was not until June of 1948, 3 years after the war had ended, that Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act. But that Displaced Persons Act was blatantly, frighteningly discriminatory. It granted visas to only those who were reliably anti-communist and excluded the Polish Jews who were not considered to be reliably anti-communist. 40% of the visas were reserved from displaced persons whose homelands had been annexed by a foreign power. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians, those DP populations with the largest numbers of collaborators, war criminals, and quislings. Eventually, President Truman was forced to support the UN resolution for the partition of Palestine and then recognize the independence of Israel, not solely because, or primarily because, he was sympathetic with the European Jews, but because they could not remain in an independent Germany, which he wanted to put together, to be part of NATO, to be part of the Western Bloc, and because the Americans and no nation on earth would support them. And though he favored the independence of Israel, more than 2/3 of the displaced Jews went to Israel, some because they wanted to, many more because there was no place on earth that welcomed them. Thank you.
Oh my. I'm going to, there we go. Well, the first question that I have is one that would seem to be a pretty obvious question, that you all are writing completely differently. Both are moving, of course. I mean, I just am astonished by your work. So I just like to say thank you in advance. But how is it you live? How is it you share each other's work with each other is my question first. I mean, do you sort of read each other as you're going along or wait till the end? I mean, or do you? You live in the same house and everything is, I mean, how different is this?
Shall I answer first?
That's between you and David.
Try not to get into a fight here. Well, David, I make him read everything I write. He's very, very well read in a literary sense as well as being a historian. And whenever he makes a suggestion, I usually sheepishly go ahead and incorporate it into my manuscript and obey his commands. On the other hand, I am afraid that he does eventually let me look at his work, but he doesn't accept my suggestions very much. And
Well, let me comment on
Okay,
that.
so it's David's turn now.
Yeah.
we can have a fight on
Oh,
screen.
no, no,
Yeah,
no, 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 no.
Denisha
No.
rarely, I think, sometimes accepts she always says she's going to accept my suggestions, and then maybe a third to 50% of the time does. Whenever I start a new book, I tell her at the beginning, I'm not going to let her read it until it's published.
It's true. He does.
And then when I've got a draft, I have no choice but to show it to her because she's the best editor I know. And I revert into being a 6-year-old lunatic. So whenever she suggests something, I scream at her and, walk around as if somebody shot my pet dog, and then eventually accept 80 to 90%.
So you each have a different process, is what you mean?
I'm much more docile, and he is much more difficult. But
Well,
the only thing he ever does actually is once in a while he'll insert a phrase like the War of 1812 and assume the reader knows what that was, and I'll say, can you just give a phrase to tell?
did you not hear that compliment about you being the best editor he ever knew?
Well, that comes from years at the New York Times when I was edited very closely.
So Denisha, what drew you to the story of the prince?
Well, actually what drew me is the novel, Henry James's novel, The Golden Bowl, is one of my favorite novels. It's very, very difficult. The Prince is not a Cliff Notes for this book, but it's dazzling, James's book. You have this aura of gentility, very little action. Everything is told from within the minds of the characters. And this terrible thing is going on. And what dazzles me about this book, two things. James never quite articulates what they know about these affairs. And two, the way he has this family resolve this is just devastating. And I'm going to leave that up to, because that is what I stole from James, and I'm going to leave that up to the readers of The Prince. But it's his last complete novel, and I've always loved him, and not everyone likes Henry James. H.G. Wells said that Henry James is like a giant hippopotamus trying to push a pea into the corner of his cage and maintain his dignity. So, that's fine. I like it. I spent a year rereading it and trying to understand what he was doing, but I just think the resolution is extraordinary in that novel.
Thank you. David, what drew you to World War II refugees?
At some point it dawned on me after many, many years that all of the Holocaust survivors I knew and the children of the Holocaust survivors didn't get to this country until 1949, 1950, 1951. And I was struck by that. It didn't register until much, much later. And I asked myself, where were they? What happened? Every good historian is a revisionist, I think. Every good historian tries to revise what we think we know about an event. And what we think we know about World War II, and certainly the American response to the Holocaust, which was not named the Holocaust for a long time after the war was over, that the American response to the suffering of the Jewish survivors was such that the sun began to shine, we opened our gates, we said, come in, welcome, and the rest of the world followed suit. And I wanted to write this hidden chapter, this unknown chapter. And it's an unknown chapter about refugees in general and the Jews who survived the Holocaust in particular.
Well, what do you think was the basis for Congress's reluctance to allow Jewish refugees from the Holocaust into the United States?
I think one, anti-Semitism, but it was a new kind of anti-Semitism. As I used to tell my students, there is no such thing as racism or anti-Semitism. Racism and anti-Semitism change from place to place, from time to time, from era to era. And after World War II, as Americans begin to enter or be prepared by their government for the Cold War to come, there is a massive Red Scare and communist witch hunting going on. And there are a large number of Southern and Midwestern, Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans who claim in veiled language, which I unveil in the book, that you can't trust the Jews because everybody, the Pope said that the Jews were responsible for, the World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. And this underground lie is sufficient to win enough votes so that a Displaced Persons Act can only be passed if the Jews who had come at some point from Poland, which is now a communist country, are kept out of the country. The act was amended in 1950, but by then, the displaced persons had gone to Israel. They weren't going to wait around from June 1948 in the hope that Congress would amend its dastardly provisions that kept them out.
I am going to switch between the two of you, so it may not, Denisha, what were the themes you wanted to explore in your novel?
I was very interested in the effects of inherited wealth. As I said, the great fortunes in this country until the age of digitalization were made during the late 19th and early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So I was interested in how people who inherited this have dealt with it. The Rockefellers, the other families, the Vanderbilts. And the other thing, then on a more human level, I was interested in how every family has secrets. I think most families have a secret. And what happens when that secret is exposed or comes to light? How does the family deal with it? And what was interesting to me is by trying to portray these characters, none of them as bad people, good people in a way, who are at the mercy of these passions that are absolutely ungovernable. Well, I thought that was very interesting. Here they are, they can't help themselves and they're doing terrible things. And I thought that was very interesting. And again, I was drawn to the end of Henry James's novel and how this family solves this terrible problem. Family secrets are very interesting, and what happens when they come to light.
Well, you mentioned you didn't think there were any bad people in the novel, but do you consider Prince and his paramour, Christina, to be bad people, or are you trying to find something redeemable about it? I mean,
I don't think of them as bad people at all. In fact, it would not be, the novel would have no value unless all the characters were, as E.M. Forster would describe it, round. It would be useless. Why would you care if these were all bad people? I think of the prince. He has no money. He has an elderly mother he has to take care of. He has no skills. He is kind of lost. And Emily, his wife, is innocent and well-meaning. Henry, the patriarch, this immensely wealthy man, has given his life over to public interest law, supporting immigrants in their desperation. And even Christina, who is a very strong person who's had no upbringing. Her father left, her mother had lots of boyfriends, and she kind of raised herself. And she just loves this guy. And I thought this was interesting to find out what happens when there's a clash between four people who are, really, they are good people. And that is, to me, what makes a novel. And dare I say it, that's what makes Shakespeare. There are no concrete villains in Shakespeare. That was his brilliance.
Good point.
not me.
Henry James is I consider difficult to read.
Yeah.
It's really tough going. So you wrote it in plain English.
Yes.
Thank you, first of all. And then second of all, how did you choose to do that?
Well, it was inescapable. In the past, as a Henry James lover, a lover of Henry James, whenever I was reading James and writing something at the same time, his language would infect me to a very deleterious extent, so that I can't do it, whatever he does. And I feel it creeping into my own work. In this case, I made a decision because actually being a journalist for so long made me very much value ordinary English. I love the language. We have an extraordinary language in my view. Very, very malleable, very elastic. And but what I love is a story. And so I just wasn't going to do what James did because I couldn't, and he'd already done it. So I wanted to see what happens in the 20th and 21st centuries to this family.
Great, thanks. Back to David. And it's very schizophrenic going back and forth between such different books. But I did want to ask you, why were Eastern European Nazi collaborators allowed in the United States, do you think? I mean, why were they?
Yeah,
I mean-
again, they were allowed in because almost from the moment the World War was over, George Kennan and the State Department, the newly found CIA, the War Department, not yet the Defense Department, they all begin preparing for a Cold War, which maybe will become World War III.
Mhm.
And we beat the Germans. Hitler's dead, the Nazis defeated. So the thinking is, why the hell not? If these people are going to be useful to us, whether they're Werner von Braun's who are going to build rockets for us, or all of these other collaborators who are going to stir up anti-communist feeling in this country, let them in. Let them in. It's despicable.
But
It's
what happened to them once they were let in? And because we ended up having the Justice Department investigate them in the end run. So how did it go from letting them in to investigating them? I mean, what happened there?
The INS, and this is one of the important stories in my book, I think, and one of the more interesting ones. The INS and the State Department, everybody else lets them in and lets them go about their business. And they lead ordinary lives for more than 2 decades. And then in the middle 70s, Liz Holtzman, who was staging a comeback, running for a Congress seat in Brooklyn. Liz Holtzman, who had been the most outspoken Jewish woman, maybe the only Jewish woman in Congress, she is having somebody leaks to her the information that the INS has a list of hundreds of collaborators who have been let into the country under the Displaced Persons Act. So Liz doesn't believe it. Congressman Holtzman doesn't believe it. And she questions the head of the INS. And she said, I was told this by an anonymous source. And the head of the INS says, it's true. And that begins because Liz Holtzman
Wow.
is, you can't stop her. And for the next 10 years, she and others sort of beat and beat and beat down the State Department and the INS to get this information out. But by the 1990s, these people are old. The collaborators are old and infirm. And they've got people like Bill Buckley and others who are saying, well, let them alone. They came to this country because they hated communism. Why should we punish them now? The last of the group was deported about 1.5 years ago. Very few were brought to justice. But what Liz Holtzman and the rest did was that they did a service to the historical record, but it was too late to do a service to humanity by making these people, by deporting them and bringing them to trial for their war crimes.
Someone in the chat asked if you know about Project Paperclip.
Oh, of course, yeah. Project Paperclip is the first attempt to bring collaborators and Nazis, not just collaborators, real dyed-in-the-wool Nazis to this country. And they were the scientists who were swept up by the army, sometimes taken out of detention camps and prisons and shipped to the United States. We all know about Paperclip, Operation Paperclip and Werner von Braun. What we don't know about is the thousands of Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Ukrainians, Romanians who come into this country and with the help of CIA money foment or accelerate this anti-communist hysteria that carries on well beyond the McCarthy period. After the McCarthy period, the search is not as much for domestic communists as it is to rally the American people to go after those nations that had fallen under the dominion of the Soviet Union. And the Nazi collaborators who are now, they change, they substitute Stalin for Hitler, the KGB for the Gestapo, the Red Army for the Wehrmacht, and they continue their propaganda.
Thank you. Denisha, what challenges did you face writing this book?
Well, one interesting challenge was Henry James was a writer who felt that love consisted in not knowing and not wanting to know. So to trace these people, these characters' realization that this awful thing was going on, the son-in-law sleeping with his mother-in-law, was difficult to show its subtlety, to describe not knowing. That was a big challenge for me. And also to, of course, bring it up into this century, because the original character is probably the second generation descendant of a robber baron. And now, I'm dealing with people who are several generations removed, and I had to figure out what would their lives be like. So the biggest challenge for me was this extraordinary thing that James does, which is not wanting to know, but sort of knowing, and then making this resolution in the novel believable.
You were a reporter at the New York Times for 11 years. How has your work as a journalist influenced your writing of novels?
Very important. First of all, when I was in my 20s, I graduated from Smith, and I came from a pretty traditional middle-class family. journalism gave me access to worlds that I would normally not have known. That was very important.
Oh,
Plus, the journalism taught me about language, at least at the New York Times, even though there were many constraints.
you're just cut out of, yeah.
Oh,
I lost
sorry.
that last sentence because I think you covered the mic or something.
Oh, sorry. Okay. At the New York Times, where I was journalist for 11 years, the language we were allowed at that time was actually much more rigid than now, but it taught me the value of precision, of exactitude, and a love of storytelling, because a good piece for the Times was a story, as we called it. So there were, but importantly was the access to all these worlds I would never have known if I hadn't been a journalist. So
I have the last three questions for the two of you because we are winding up our evening. One of the questions I always ask is, what emerging author do you think we might have missed that you think we should know about? And I believe Denisha has an answer to that. She has someone she
do.
wants to share with us.
I have a very, very eager answer, which is a Scottish author called Douglas Stewart, who wrote a book called Shuggie Bain about the post-industrial world of Glasgow and the people, the unemployed, the people desperate to make a living, the children cast adrift, their mothers trying very hard. He's extraordinary. And now he's written another novel called Little Mungo, which I'm reading, and I cannot recommend him enough.
What advice do you have for people writing their first book? Just quick advice. I know we could probably spend all night teaching a class here, but
don't write something just because you think you want to publish it. Try to write from within yourself. Tell a story you want to tell. Follow your instincts. I don't think, I mean, there are obviously people who write genre novels who are immensely successful and brilliant, but that would be my advice. Just tell your story. Tell a story. People love stories. They love to hear them. They love to read them. And you're doing a favor if you can pull it off to the reader.
thank you. David?
Yeah, what I'm reading now, I don't have
You don't have advice? Yeah, so tell me what you're reading.
advice, but let me tell you what I'm reading now. I'm alternating between everything Chang Ray Lee has written, an extraordinary novelist. His later novels are absolutely brilliant, brilliantly flawed and brilliant. And I'm alternating between that and the collected works of Mick Herron, the espionage writer, a cross between, Carl Hyacin and John le Carré. And they're absolutely brilliant. Yeah, and don't just watch the Apple or HBO Slow Horses special, which is based on those books. Read the books; they're incredible. Let me, if I can add just one thing. If
Absolutely.
I see people in the chat have asked questions, I'd be happy. Let me give you my email. It's Nasaw, DNASAW @gc.cuny.edu. And if you have any
Did I
questions,
put it in? Did I?
please.
DNASAW@gc.cuny.edu.
Right. And if
I
you have
just
any
put it in the
questions or
chat.
comments or ideas, please let me know.
Absolutely. Folks, it's been a wonderful evening. Thank you for your flexibility coming over to Zoom. I think we found a new home. So I am going to say the good evenings. I'd like to thank Denisha and David for participating in Write America this evening, and to everyone who tuned in tonight, thank you for making the leap over to Zoom. And thank you to Roger Rosenblatt for creating this original and important series to look forward to each Monday evening. Tonight's episode is the perfect example of the purpose and mission of Write America. We hope to see you all next week, Monday, August 22nd at 7, as we welcome Nicole Hebden and Dan Barry. Please note, we are going to permanently move to Zoom after Labor Day weekend. Details are on our Write America website. Please remember to check out Bird's Books, Write America page, where you can sign up for upcoming episodes and maybe purchase a book or two. Thank you all.
Thank you.